Today I've got a fun project in store. It's going to let me work a little bit with wood and a little bit with epoxy. I'm going to make a set of coasters. I made 3 sets of these coasters that feature an epoxy stripe down the side of it, and I just wanted to play with different combinations of epoxy colors and wood species. So I've got a maple with a little bit of curl figure to it, and I mixed some what's called ocean blue was the name of the color, and silver. This is quarter sawn white oak, and I mixed up just silver, metallic. And then this is wenge, and I mixed up just white with the epoxy. And the whole point was just to give me different opportunities to figure out how the epoxy works, how I could get different color combinations, and you can be as creative as you want to be and mix and match any wood or epoxy color you want. So now you've seen the finished project. Now let's go back in time and I'll show you how I made them. Okay, hopefully future me just showed you some really cool epoxy coasters. If not, I apologize for whatever it is that's about to happen. But let's get started. I'm starting with a 1/2 inch thick by 4 inch wide by 16 inch long piece of wood that I'm going to cut a groove in, fill with epoxy, and then I'll cut this piece into 4 by 4 inch coasters. So the first step is to cut the groove in these boards that will hold the epoxy. Now you can make this groove any width you want. You can locate it anywhere you want on the board. In this case, I'm going to make it 1 inch wide. I'm going to locate it about 5/8 of an inch from the edge, so it's off center. And I'm going to make it about 3/16 of an inch deep, so not quite halfway the thickness of this 1/2 inch board. Now there's 2 main ways you could do this, with a table saw or with a router table. So I'm going to show you both. To cut the groove with a table saw, I set the blade height to 3/16 of an inch, I set the fence to 5/8 inch from the blade, and then I made multiple passes, moving the fence slightly further from the blade with each pass until I had completed a 1 inch wide groove. When cutting the groove with the router table, I installed a 1/4 inch wide straight bit, but you could use any diameter straight bit up to the width of the groove you want. I set the bit height to 3/16 of an inch, and I set the fence to be 1 inch and 5/8 from the bit. And then, as I made multiple passes, I moved the fence closer to the bit with each pass until I had a 1 inch wide groove. Now when routing this way, it's called a climb cut, and so the bit wants to grab the workpiece and pull it. So you want to have a good firm grip on the workpiece. The reason I cut it this way is it creates less chipping. And once the groove is cut, clean up any blade marks or bit marks left in the bottom with a chisel. You don't have to do this, but I think it will make for a cleaner transition when I cut the coasters apart. Now the blanks are ready for epoxy, but before we pour, we need to cap the ends with pieces of tape to keep the epoxy from just flowing right out of the groove. I'm just using some black duct tape. Now it's time for us to mix and pour the epoxy. I'm going to be using Moss Tabletop Pro because it can be poured to a depth of a 1/4 inch, and these grooves are 3/16, so we should be good that way. You wouldn't want to use any epoxy that's intended for a deep pour because this is so shallow and it would take a long time to cure. You also want to avoid any epoxies that tend to yellow when they cure, unless that's the color you want. But because I'm tinting, I don't want the yellow to interfere with the color of our epoxy. Okay, now it's time to do a little bit of math. I promise it won't be too bad. We need to calculate the volume of epoxy that we're going to need so that we can mix the correct amount. We do that by multiplying length times width times depth. So it's a 16 inch long board, 1 inch wide groove, and we're going to say that it's a 1/4 inch deep just to give us a little extra volume. So 16 times 1, 16 times 0.25 for a 1/4, that gives us 4 cubic inches. That's the volume of epoxy we need. Now we need to convert that into liters, and you do that by dividing the 4 cubic inches by 61. Or you can just Google 4 cubic inches to liters, and Google will tell you that that comes out to be 0.065. So that's 0.065 liters, which then converted to milliliters is 65 milliliters. So that's how much we need to mix, 65 milliliters. All right, so now we know how much epoxy we need, 65 milliliters. So the measuring cup I have is divided into cc's, cubic centimeters. Cubic centimeters and millimeters are the same, so we need 65 cubic centimeters. And this measuring cup is divided in 25 cc increments. So rather than mix 65 cc's, I'm just going to mix 100 cc's so that I can use the increments on the cup. Now, the Tabletop Pro that I'm using is a 1-to-1 mix ratio. So I'm going to pour 50 cc's of part A and 50 cc's of part B, add the tint, mix it up, and we'll be ready to pour. I mix parts A and B in a 1-to-1 ratio for 2 minutes, scraping the sides to make sure everything gets mixed. Then I transferred the epoxy into a new clean mixing container, added a couple drops of colored tint. I mixed this all up for 2 more minutes and then let it rest for 2 minutes, and then I was ready to pour. I very carefully poured the mix into the groove and filled it right to the top without overflowing. I think it'll be easier to sand the whole thing flush if I don't have a lot of extra epoxy. I left the epoxy untouched for 10 minutes, and then I used a propane torch 6 to 8 inches away and quickly waved it over the top to pop any bubbles that had risen to the surface. Okay, all 3 are poured and I let them cure overnight, so now we're ready to sand them flush and then cut the coasters apart. I started sanding with a rough grit, like 80, and then worked up through the grits, 100, 120, 150, and 220. Once I finished with the 220, I will go back and hand sand the epoxy strip with 320 and 400 just to polish it up before finishing. Next, I cut the coasters apart on the miter saw, and then I took them back over to the workbench and sanded a chamfer around the top edges. Okay, we've reached the final step. All I have left to do is wipe on a few coats of wipe-on finish, and they'll be ready to use. So here they are, the finished coasters. This was a fun project, and it was not difficult, and it was fun to learn about using the epoxy. And I didn't have to use gallons of epoxy, which is nice. I mean, I only used about this much of the kit, and based on that, I could probably make 35 or 40 sets of coasters just with this half-gallon kit. And the cost, I did a little bit of math, works out to about 70 cents in materials per coaster. That does not include the wood, but this is a perfect project for using up your scraps. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned a little bit about epoxies. I'm Dan Carey with Rockler and Woodworkers Journal. Thanks for watching.